Right, so before we do get started, could I just ask people to type into the chat what your experience with Vectorworks is? I just want to get an idea if any of you have used it before or whether you're completely new to it. I just want to get an idea of kind of who we have. I've got the chat open on the side. Just feel free to type in. And then we'll make a start. Cool, so Sahim's a beginner, completely new to it. Brilliant, that's what I like to hear. Anyone else? It's one of those softwares that's really powerful. It's a really, really good software once you know it. But getting started with Vectorworks is so difficult if you're trying to do it on your own. So I did just want to kind of start off with this one first at the beginning of the semester. I know there's been quite a few requests for learning Vectorworks. And we'll talk about the differences between Vectorworks and a few other packages as well. But hopefully you'll find this useful. Cool, so it seems like everyone's a beginner. Good. Right, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to quickly start off with obtaining Vectorworks, because as I said, it's not currently available in one of the computer labs, which is why we're doing it online today. And I'm sure most of you have already gone through this process, so you're prepared for today. But essentially, if you're signing up for the first time, you want to navigate to student.myvectorworks.net. To make it easy, you can simply search for Vectorworks Student, and it'll be the first link. So super, super easy to find. And I'll post this one into the chat as well, just so you've got a copy. All you'd need to do is follow through this section on the right. So get free educational software, enter your university email address. So this is going to be your MMU name-based email address. Follow it through. In fact, you know what? Let me just do a fake one. bob@gmail.com. So I'm just doing a fake one just for a minute, just so we can have a look through. Let's just use the first one. Yeah, so when you click on create, it asks you to enter an activation code. So you'll get an email come through, you'll copy and paste the activation code, and then you go on to the next step, which is your account information. And that's really straightforward. It's just asking you for your student details, contact details, things like that. And at the bottom, it will ask you to take a picture of your student ID card, upload the ID card, you get verified within about 2 to 3 days. It is worth mentioning that if you don't do that, you'll be able to use the trial for about 30 days, which isn't too bad, but it will expire after that. And also as well, even if you have verified it here and it's all been approved and everything, once you open the software, it's going to ask you to activate it. And if you don't activate it within the 30 days, that will also kill your account as well. So just something to bear in mind. Essentially, sign up and activate it here. And then when you open the software, it should prompt you to activate. Make sure you're activating it there too. I think apart from that, I think that's pretty much it with the online stuff. It's pretty straightforward. I do just want to quickly mention about the learning portal as well. So in fact, if I actually log in properly this time, just want to talk to you about some extra resources that can be useful. So I'm actually logged in with my proper account now. If you need to install it on another device, you can just click on download once you've signed in, and this will bring you to your details. I'm obviously going to have to blur this out because that's my serial number. Don't use my serial number because I need this for teaching. Please don't use that. Get your own, you get it for free, you'll be absolutely fine. But the cool thing is that it is available for both Windows and Mac. And I believe you can install it on up to 2 devices at a time, which is pretty useful. So if, for instance, you wanted to have it on a tower computer at home and you wanted it on a portable laptop, you can do that. So it's quite nice. Oh, no, we're not going to go to that just yet. There's a few tabs you can click through. So for instance, the product tab on their website, it just basically tells you what each of the workspaces are used for. And we're going to look at the workspaces today as well. So Vectorworks Architect, I'm sure you can guess what that's used for. Vectorworks Landmark is typically for landscape-based architectural modeling. Spotlight and Fundamentals, these are more kind of reduced versions, essentially, of Vectorworks. So Vectorworks Spotlight, this is particularly useful if you're doing anything regarding lighting. So it says here, if you're designing lighting, scenery sets, events, theatrical productions or exhibits, this is really, really useful. And it's the same thing with fundamentals as well. If you don't want all of the advanced tools, if you just want a simplified interface while you're getting started, you can use Vectorworks fundamentals. And again, I'll show you how you can access those. It's worth looking at the support tab as well. So Vectorworks, unfortunately, does have a habit of crashing from time to time. So it's one of those ones where you're going to want to make sure that you're saving often. And again, I'll show you how to set up your autosaves correctly today as well. But it does crash from time to time. You might run into a couple of little graphics issues if your drivers and stuff aren't updated. So rather than trying to figure all this stuff out yourself, you can either bombard me with emails, which is fine. And obviously you can sign up to the clinics, the drop-in clinics via Moodle, or you can visit the community forum. So it's completely free access. You can just click on the forum. You got actually a couple of forums there. You got the user groups and you got Planet Vectorworks and the Vectorworks community. And essentially you can just search for like most common issues like troubleshooting. You can ask for stuff specific to architecture, site design, visualization, how to render and animate, all sorts of things that you might run into. And again, if you're having issues with hardware, for instance, if you can't print properly, if you're trying to bring in a drawing tablet, you can do all those things, but these might help you just get started with them. Lastly, we have training. Now, training is extremely useful. There's a few things here, for instance, the Vectorworks Getting Started guides. They're okay. We can take a quick look at those. Internet's not the quickest today. So this one's actually really good. It brings you to Vectorworks University, which is what I'm going to show you in a minute. This is the one that I would use. The Vectorworks forum we just spoke about. So that's where you can get kind of bespoke help one-to-one. And then you've got the Vectorworks video library on YouTube, which I'm actually not too big a fan of. I think their Vectorworks University package is much, much stronger. And obviously you have us to help you as well. So I'm just going to talk to you now about Vectorworks University. And in fact, I'll paste a link to this one into the chat as well, because again, this should be quite useful. Essentially what Vectorworks University does is it allows you to learn at your own pace. So imagine it's kind of similar to like LinkedIn Learning, Archistar, those types of online video services. Really, really similar. So essentially all you do here is you sign in. Once you've made your Vectorworks account, you can just sign in here. It's the same credentials everywhere, so you don't need to make new accounts. And all I would do is I would click on courses at the top and wait for it patiently to load. There we go. And it brings you to an absolute ton of courses that you can play around with. For those of you that have used Vectorworks before, and if you're struggling to find out what things have changed, I recommend you look at the UI improvements video, because things like snapping, for instance, they've removed the tool palette for that now. They've actually built it into the UI. So again, if you have used it before, I recommend you check out that video. You can find the same video on YouTube as well. It's really, really useful. It helped me significantly. But let's say, for instance, we're brand new, we're just getting started. And let's say it's after this session and you've forgotten everything that I've spoken about. All you would need to do is click on this first tab and choose what it is that you want to do. So if you're relatively new, you probably start with getting started. We'll wait for that to refresh. And now that shows us all of the getting started videos. So for instance, we've got the basics over here on the left. I can see that this course is 2 hours long. So I can click on view more, or I could just click on the name of the course. Once the course loads, it's going to show us a little bit of a synopsis about it, each of the sections that you'll be going through, and you can just click on start course to actually get started. So each one has its own video, and it's again super, super useful. And they're all broken down into kind of bite-sized chunks. So each one's about 5 to 10 minutes. Some of them a bit lower, some a bit higher, but average is about 5 to 10 minutes. And essentially, as I said, it's just going to take you through all of the essentials And this is what I'm going to kind of do with you today as well. But it's going to give you a good opportunity to ask some questions back when you get a bit stuck with stuff. So again, should be quite useful. It's worth mentioning as well that once you do get quite proficient with Vectorworks, you can then move on to the more complex things. That's going to click back on courses. Internet really isn't doing too well today. Maybe I want to do something a bit more advanced. Maybe I want to get into some modeling, or maybe I want to do some buildings. If I click on buildings, I can just have a look through these, and it's going to tell me how I can do like different types of construction details, how to make custom walls and custom objects, how you can then start working with things like ArcGIS, how you can get started with BIM. So again, there's a lot of useful things. You might have noticed this one here that says Revit export improvements. So good thing with Vectorworks now is it does have Revit support. So I would personally say, and this is my personal opinion, I would say that Revit is seen as the kind of main BIM software. Revit itself isn't BIM, but it supports BIM modeling, building information modeling. And the good thing with Vectorworks is it does it as well. And the good thing now is that you can now export between Vectorworks and Revit. So files can work between the two. They've got really similar systems now. So really, really nice to know. One more thing, of course, is let's say, for instance, you're not quite sure what it is you want to learn, but you know you're getting a bit more proficient. You could just change the difficulties to intermediate or advanced, and it will just show you all of the intermediate or advanced type stuff. So again, it really gets quite heavy, the stuff you can learn. So again, working on like level 2 BIM, where you're sharing projects and central files between people. It's all the collaborative stuff, animation, visualization, all sorts of stuff there. So I think that's about it. The only final thing I wanted to share with you as a resource before we get started is the keyboard shortcuts. So as you can see, I've navigated back to Teams. I'm on our Introduction to Vectorworks tab. And if you click on the File section, there is a PDF file that you can download here. And it's really, really useful. So if I just open this up, it's going to have all of the keyboard shortcuts. And you might have noticed it says Vectorworks 2021 shortcuts. And I'm actually going to be using Vectorworks 2022 today. It is mostly the same, like 99% the same. A couple of little things have changed. Even I haven't worked out which ones have and haven't changed yet, because there's about 4 pages of these. By no means do you need to learn every single one, but I would recommend you print off at least the first page, because these are the tools you're going to be using the most, essentially. So things like your basic tool palette, so how to draw lines and shapes and do your drawings. You've got the building shells, you've got 3D modeling tools, visualization tools, and then how to do notes and annotations. So if you know most of these shortcuts, as you kind of start using the software, you'll then be able to work much, much faster in it. It's going to save you a lot of time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to give everyone just a couple of minutes to download that. And when you're ready, I want you to open Vectorworks. And that's what I'm going to do as well. It might take a couple of minutes to open. I'll turn my webcam off as well, try and save a bit of bandwidth. Internet doesn't seem to be the best. So again, for anyone who missed any of that, I just want you to open Vectorworks, and I also want you to download that keyboard shortcuts list, which you can access by going to Introduction to Vectorworks, go to Files, download the keyboard shortcuts. Maybe one more minute and then we'll crack straight back on. I think that's probably enough time to get the software open. Right. So a couple of things. If it's your first time opening the software, it's probably going to ask you to activate it. It might ask you to sign in and activate, or it might just say click activate. I strongly recommend you do that now. And again, I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to quickly do that because it can take up to about 30 seconds. Again, if you choose to close the box and if you don't activate it, and if you keep doing that for 30 days, you'll lose access to Vectorworks. And you'll need to contact them directly so they can restore the access. And that's a nightmare to do. It's a bit of a pain finding their contact details. So again, I'm going to give you just 30 more seconds. Just click on activate when it appears. It's not on my screen because I've already activated mine. And the other thing it might ask you as well is, do you want to download any additional libraries? I would just say click no on that for now, just because we're going to save you internet connection. I'll show you how you can add in your extra libraries after. And I'll talk to you and tell you what libraries are, just in case you don't know. So again, it's going to give you 30 seconds, go through the activation, and then we'll carry on. Do just want to mention as well, by the way, because I'm using multiple screens, I've got the Teams chat open on the side on another monitor. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to raise a hand or just feel free to start typing questions in the chat and I'll try and answer them as soon as I can. So you're more than welcome to do that. Right, that should be enough time to activate and say no to installing the libraries just yet. Again, if you're watching a repeat of this, feel free to pause this video and just download those libraries now. That's also absolutely fine. It's not a problem. But once you click OK, you should be presented with something that looks a bit similar to this. Don't worry if it doesn't look exactly like this. It might have just loaded into a different interface. It might have also asked you what you're going to be using it for. So for instance, if you're an architecture student, you probably want to say architecture. And you might also have an option that says architecture-BIM. If you're looking to do BIM stuff, by all means choose that. But when you're getting started with Vectorworks, I'd recommend you just choose architect. And again, if you're a landscape student, you might want to choose the landmark toolsets. But essentially, you can always change between these really easily by clicking on the tools drop down at the top. Coming to the very bottom one that says workspaces, and you can choose between those different workspaces here. So I said to you earlier that the fundamentals one is a much more simplified version. If I click on fundamentals, you'll see it's now massively simplified my file, my Vectorworks. In fact, I might have even crashed it. I did say it does crash from time to time. There we go, I crashed it. There's another thing with Vectorworks as well that can pose a problem. If you're using multiple monitors, sometimes it will crash if you move Vectorworks to another monitor. I'm hoping mine's not going to do that. If it does, I'll just move it to another screen and share that. It's not a problem. It can be a problem. So I'm on Architect at the moment. Let's just try and navigate into one more. Let's say, for instance, Landmark, if you're doing any landscape. No, it's killing itself. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to very quickly close Vectorworks. I'm just going to reopen it in another screen. I'm going to share that one instead. So I can see there's a question in the chat. What is the difference between the Architect and Architect BIM? To be honest, not a huge amount of difference. I mean, Vectorworks itself is pretty much a BIM-based software. For those of you that don't understand what BIM is just yet, BIM stands for Building Information Modeling. So essentially what that means is, as well as being able to produce the technical drawings, it's also going to be producing a 3D model as you produce the drawings, and it's going to contain all the information about the building within it. So for instance, you could have, if you're drawing like a wall, for instance, it will tell you, it would basically create not just the wall itself, but it would create all of the elements inside of the wall. So if you're doing a cavity, for instance, you might have a layer of brick, you might have an open cavity, you might have some insulation in there, you might have another brick on the other side, and then maybe like some gypsum plasterboard or something. And the good thing about this is it will then tell you at the end of the project, or you can call it up at any time, what materials you're using. So you can create a bill of materials. You can extract things like costings from it. You can do different types of analysis on it. So for instance, you can do your solar analysis, you can do heat and ventilation, and that's essentially what the BIM tools are. Whereas the architect tools are just mostly about the modeling itself. The good thing though is you can always switch between workspaces after you've already started making the model. So let's say you got started with fundamentals, which is the most basic one, and then you realized actually I want some of the more complex tools. Maybe I want to add the landscape in around the building. You could switch to landmark and then you could add those in. But realistically, you can access most of those tools between them anyway. So I've got mine over here on the left. I'm going to talk to you about these in a sec anyway. So what I'm going to quickly do, I'm just going to very quickly attempt to move this to another screen. Oh, damn. I'm actually struggling to move it to another screen. As I say, Vectorworks has a weird bug where if you're doing it on multiple monitors, it does tend to crash. So I'm hoping it's going to let me move it to another screen without dying. If not, I might need to quickly change a setting on my end. So even just moving it like that might crash it. Yeah. Right, okay, give me 1 sec. I'm just going to quickly reconfigure my monitors and then we shall carry on. There we go. Right, annoyingly, I can't actually change between them. You guys should be having a much, much easier time than me. Once you've chosen your workspace, and again, I'm going to be using Architect today. Once you've chosen your workspace, that's going to basically change the layout of the tools. And essentially for me, I've got my basic tools palette over here on the left. I've got my main other tool sets I can choose between, my specialist tool sets just underneath. And a new thing, which I actually don't like with the newest Vectorworks, is it now docks the attributes palette down here on the left. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to click where it says attributes, and I'm just going to click and drag and just pull this out. I'm just going to bring this up towards the top left of the viewport. You see that what this does, it now expands this section for my tool sets on the left. I find this much, much nicer to use. So for instance, I'm currently on site planning. This has all of my site planning tools. So I could start creating terrains, I can add in roads and things like that. I can go to building shell, and this is where I can find my walls, my doors, my windows, stairs, things like that. I have 3D modeling. And again, this is where I can do generic 3D modeling. So I can make my cubes and spheres and stuff like that. I can start sculpting with things there as well. So if I wanted to make custom objects, I could do that relatively easily with those 3D tools. Same thing for visualization. You can add in things like lighting, cameras, you can change materials. So that could be particularly useful. And there is a brand new button in there for Datasmith Direct Link Tool. So for those of you that have already done a bit of visualization, you might have heard of Unreal Engine and Twinmotion. They are absolutely fantastic pieces of software to get you started with rendering. And I'd recommend you actually get started with Twinmotion first. It's completely free for students. You could just Google Twinmotion and you'll be able to download it. And yeah, essentially you just click this button, it will send your 3D model to the rendering engine and you can go through and render stuff out from there. It's a nice system. Just to look at a few more of these, we've got furnitures and fixtures over here on the left. So again, you can start adding in objects to start populating your interiors. This is relatively nice. You've got dims and notes. So again, this is for things like annotations. If you were to start adding, for instance, like the little level annotations, if you were to add measurements, angles, all that sort of stuff you can do here. If you want to do call out bubbles, you can do that too. And yeah, you'll find all of that there. We'll play with them a little bit, hopefully today. MEP, that's mechanical, electrical, plumbing. So again, you can start adding things like MEP stuff into your buildings. You've then also got detailing. So if let's say you're doing some construction details, and let's say you don't want to be manually drawing nuts and bolts and screws and stuff, you will find all of these here. And even things like insulation. So if you're adding things like batting, which essentially looks like the squiggly lines, you'd have seen them on section drawings most likely. You know, you can add these things in super, super easy. You don't need to manually draw these shapes anymore. It's going to save you a lot of time. The basic tool palette, I kind of glossed over that a little bit. Again, these are your basic drawing tools. They're the same as what you'll find in software like AutoCAD, Revit, Rhino, obviously Vectorworks, 3ds Max, SketchUp. They're the same tools you'll find everywhere, more or less. So for instance, you've got your selection tool, you've got your text tool, you've got lines and polylines, you've got your shapes. You kind of can't go too wrong with these. I'm going to show you how to use these because they're not very intuitive the first time you use them, but we're going to come to using tools in a little bit. I'm not going to talk about the attributes panel just yet that we dragged out. We're going to look at that once we start using the software. At the very top of the screen, we have what is called the ribbon. And the ribbon, in fact, this is always called the ribbon in software. That's worth knowing. If ever you have problems with the top panel, in your software, whether it's Vectorworks or Illustrator or Rhino, always try and Google the name of the software followed by the word ribbon. And 9 times out of 10, you'll find out how to troubleshoot it. And essentially, the main thing with the ribbon in all softwares is that it's the thing that changes depending on the tool that you're using. So for instance, if I click on my rectangle tool, my ribbon has changed. So it's giving me information about how I can use my tool. If I go to this squiggly freehand tool, again, I get different options. So that's worth knowing. You know, essentially you select your tool on the left, you look at the ribbon to basically configure how you want to use that tool, and then you go ahead and use it. It's a little bit more complicated than that with Vectorworks because you need to set up specific layer types and things like that. But again, we're going to cover all of those essentials today. Just above the section on the ribbon, you've also got these other drop downs. So this one says active class, active design layer, active plane that you're working on. These ones actually relate down to the navigation section down here. And at the moment, we don't have any of these additional layers set up, so there's no point playing around with these just yet. But essentially, I'm going to talk to you about what these do in a minute. And it's this section down here, this navigation section, that trips everyone up. It tripped me up when I started learning. It took me a long time to get my head around it. But I think I've found a good way to explain those now. I hope so anyway. So again, we'll come to those shortly. I am just going to very quickly make a shape. You don't need to do this just yet. But essentially, I just want to show you this section up here in the top right. So we've got the object info palette, which is this window up here in the top right. This essentially becomes your properties window. So if I click on my object here, I clicked on my rectangle, I'm in my object info shape panel, and I'm on the shape tab. So this is telling me the object is a rectangle. It's telling me what class it is, what layer it's currently sitting on, what plane it was drawn on. And again, we're going to play with that in a little bit. Don't worry about knowing what these things are yet. But the good thing with this is we can actually play around with this. So for instance, if I wanted to resize something after I've drawn it, this is currently 5,400 by 3,400. Maybe I actually wanted this to be 3,000 by 3,000. So I could click on the width, type in 3,000, click on the height, type in 3,000, and that's going to resize my object. And it does get a bit more complex than that. There's this little bit just underneath. So for instance, we're currently making this rectangle. And you see I've got a little dot on the top left corner of the rectangle, yeah? So this essentially acts as like a base point. For those of you that are familiar with AutoCAD, you'll know what I'm talking about with base points. But if not, don't worry. But essentially, it's just saying that any changes I make are going to be in relation to this top left point, because that's the point I have selected. So for instance, if I change the width again to 6,000, when I hit enter, you'll see that the top left corner stays where it is, and it's everything else that changes. So like that. So that's now widened out. And again, the same thing with the height. If I were to change this to 5 meters, hit enter, that top left corner is going to stay the same. And now it's changed size. But the cool thing with this is I can click on any of these points and I can tell it to scale or change shape or rotate from that point. So for instance, if I now click on the central point and try and resize this, if I tell this to be 100, you see it's brought it in on both sides. So it might take you a little while to get your head around, but it's actually a really, really useful thing to use, this info panel just at the top right. Once you get the hang of it, super, super nice. And again, we'll play with that a little bit today. Right, final things. We obviously have our main viewport in the middle. So this is the area that we draw on. And this is always called a viewport, no matter what software you're using, whether it's SketchUp, whether it's Rhino, whether it's AutoCAD, it's always going to be called your viewport. And it's essentially where you interact with your files. Now, if you're relatively new to drawing on computers, if you're like a first year or second year student, for instance, if you've never done any CAD work before, this might confuse you a little bit. Because the thing that people tend to struggle with here is understanding scale. So for instance, that shape that I had just now, this one, you know, I could type in dimensions into this. I could type in 3 meters by 3 meters. If you're an architect or architecture student, typically we're always going to work in millimeters in the UK because we're using the metric system. If you're watching this in America, if you somehow found this video, you might want to use the imperial system, in which case you'd be working in inches. And again, I'll show you how you can configure this stuff in a minute. But essentially, you'll see that even though I've typed in 3000 by 3000, this obviously isn't 3 meters on my screen, right? You know, because my screen isn't 3 meters wide. So, and I could zoom in and out of this as well. And it's not changing the scale of the object. It just means I'm moving closer or further away from my object. So imagine you've drawn this on a piece of paper. If I zoom out, it's the equivalent of pulling my head away from the object. If I'm zooming in, it's like I'm bringing my head closer to the object. But the object itself is still keeping its same dimensions. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Right, now on to the bit that everyone hates. So we've got navigation, this navigation panel down here in the bottom right. And essentially we've got a few tabs here that are going to be the main thing that you use in Vectorworks. And again, this is the bit that trips people up. But it's actually really simple once you get the hang of it. So I would say ignore the last 2 tabs for now, like saved views and references. We're not going to use those just yet. We're going to focus on the first 4. Now, the first one is called classes. And essentially, this is where we set up the visual style of our objects. So for instance, I could set up things like patterns and hatches to go inside my shapes. I could set up my line weights here. I could set up colors for objects and line thicknesses and things. All of that stuff I can do in classes. And again, we'll play with that in a minute. Design layers. This is where the geometry actually lives. So for instance, if I'm making a shape, it's going to currently go onto my design layer 1. And then I could change the visual style of that object by selecting it and assigning a class to that object. So hopefully that makes sense. That's the thing that people hate the most. The third tab is sheet layers. And sheet layers are essentially, if you're looking to print out your drawing, you can basically tell your drawing to go onto your sheet at a specified scale. Actually, no, that's not quite true. It's a kind of combination between sheets and viewports. So the sheet is just setting up the page size. So for instance, I could configure this to be A3 landscape as an example. And then it's the viewports where I can tell the drawing from the design layer to go onto that sheet layer. That's a better way to explain it. So just to quickly recap that, classes are the visual style of the objects. Design layers are where the objects live. Sheet layers are where we define our sheets. So I could have any number of sheets here. And I could have them any number of sizes. You don't have to only work in A3, A2, or A1. You can change them to whatever you want them to be. Then the viewport is just what we set up to take the information from the design layer and to place it onto one of the sheets. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, I'm sure you're itching by now to actually get started making some things. Because again, we are about 45 minutes into the session. We haven't actually used anything yet. So what I want you to do, I want you just to start having a look at some of these basic tools in the top left. We're going to play with the 2D ones first, and then we are going to play with the 3D building modeling tools. I'm going to show you some best practice on how to use those. So what I want you to do, I just want you to make a couple of shapes. So I'm going to use my rectangle tool, and I'm going to use my circle tool. So I'm just going to make a few overlapping shapes, a few disconnected shapes. I'm just going to get a feel for how these are working. I'm going to give you about 60 seconds just to begin with, just to click on some of those tools and just start dragging some shapes out. Just realized I've turned something off on mine that you might not have turned off on yours. Some of you might have this tab called Resource Manager, and it might be getting in the way. When you're not hovering over it, it might be docked like that. When you hover over it, it expands. I would recommend you turn this off for now. I'm going to show you the Resource Manager in a bit. It is really useful, but really frustrating when you're always going up to the top of the screen. So you could choose to dock it somewhere, or you could just choose to close it and reopen it when you need to. And if ever you accidentally close any of these, you can always just go back to Window, go to Palettes, and you can always reopen your palettes here. So I think that's enough time just to set up a couple of different shapes. Again, we're not looking at actually drawing these with any accuracy just yet. I just want to get you using some classes to begin with. So what I want to do, I want you to come down to this navigation section down here in the bottom right. I want you just to click on the very first tab, which should say Classes. And again, if your interface looks different to this, you want to go to Tools, Workspaces, and just double check that you're definitely working in the Architect workspace. If yours looks different to mine, just click on a different workspace, wait for that to load, click back on Architect, and it should bring you back to here. So I'm on my classes. Now, currently we've got two classes. We've got no class, which currently says none. And this just means that there's no attributes assigned to the objects. And you see that currently it's got a little tick next to it to say that this is the active class. So this means that any shapes that we draw at the moment, it's going to automatically apply these this class to these objects. Yeah. If I wanted to add dimensions to these, you remember I said we've got dims and notes down here. If I were adding dimensions, I might want to use my dimension class. And what this would do is it would just change the line types to dashed, for instance. It might make the line weights a little bit thinner because they're not main objects, they're just annotative objects. And again, it's going to make the visual style of my drawings just that little bit nicer. Now, let's say, for instance, we wanted to set up our own line weights and colors and hatches and things. We can do that really easily just by right-clicking in the empty space on our classes and just clicking on New. So again, I'm on my class layer, my class tab. Just going to right-click, go to New, and this allows me to make a new class. Am I sharing? Yeah, I'm sharing my screen. Can people just type into the chat to let me know if they can see my new floating window? So I have a feeling where I'm sharing window and not screen, this might not be appearing for you. Can anyone see a window I'm dragging around that says new class? We can see it. Yes, perfect. Okay, that's worked. Right, phew. Annoyingly, when you share on Teams, if you choose window instead of screen, sometimes it doesn't show pop-up windows. So I just wanted to triple check that. Right, let's say I'm just going to work on line weights to begin with. So I'm going to call this one thick line weight. Hopefully everyone knows what line weights are. If you don't, I can very quickly explain it. And in fact, I just want to ask, who can tell me how many line weights we should have at minimum in a drawing? Any volunteers? Again, you can answer in the chat. That's also fine. It doesn't matter if you're wrong either. How many line weights do you think we would need in an architectural drawing? 3 to 4. Yeah, I would say that's a good number. I would say a minimum of 3 is always good. As many as you need. Yep, I kind of like that answer as well. Essentially, there's no right answer. But the key thing is that it is kind of as many as you need. You know, it's all about what these line weights are representing. So the key thing here is, you know, you're able to differentiate between objects in your drawing. So for instance, you might have anything that's structural, anything that's permanent in your model might have the thickest line weight. Anything that's essentially not a permanent object like furniture might be a thin line weight. Anything that's semi-permanent might be a medium line weight. Anything that's annotative might have its own line weight type, which would be really thin and dashed, for instance. So again, you know, you can have a variety of line weights, but essentially you always want to use a doubling factor when it comes to line weights. So for instance, if I have my thinnest line weight having a line thickness of 0.1, then my medium line weight would have a thickness of 0.2, and then my thick line weight would have a thickness of 0.4, because it would be double that of my medium. And it's a really good system to work with, because it means that no matter what page size you print off, no matter what scale you're working to, if you're always using a doubling factor, you'll always be able to differentiate between line weights. I think it's a really good way to work. And obviously the line weights that you choose depend on the scale of the drawing you're printing out and the page size. So for instance, if I'm printing out a drawing on an A4 piece of paper, if I were to use super thick line weights, it's going to look like a really messy, heavy drawing. Whereas if I use slightly thinner ones, it's going to look much nicer and a bit more cleaner. If I were to use those same thin, clean line weights on a massive A0 printout, I'm not going to be able to differentiate between them, because the object is now so much bigger, but the line weights are still essentially the same. So using thicker line weights on a bigger sheet would make more sense. So there's no right or wrong which line weights you choose, but you should always use a doubling factor. Hopefully you learned something there. Hopefully you found that useful. Anywho, back to Vectorworks. So I've come back to create new class. I'm going to call this thick line weight. And instead of clicking OK, I'm just going to tick on this button that says Edit Properties After Creation. And you'll want to get into the swing of using this often. So every time you make something, edit the properties after creation and click OK. And that will load up this window. So hopefully everyone can see the edit classes window that's just popped up. If that's not working for any reason, you can just right click and go to edit. So right click on the one that said thick line weight, go to edit, and now you should see this window popping up. And again, if you can't see my window, please let me know in the chat. Just let me know, say, Jay, we can't see it, and I'll fix it. So I've got this one called thick line weight, and there's a few things that we can do here. So firstly, I'm actually going to go to my textures tab, and I'm going to turn off this button that says use at creation. Because this is a line weight layer, I'm not going to be applying any textures to my objects here. So I'm just going to tick that one off, or untick it even. I'm going to come back to my graphic attributes. So we've got a few things here. I would recommend ticking that button that says use at creation on the graphics attribute. And what this means is that if we have that layer enabled, as we make new objects, it's going to automatically apply the settings that we make here to our object. Now, this is really straightforward. So we've got a box that says fill and a box that says pen. So essentially, whatever we put in the fill box, this is going to be its filled in color and texture. whatever we put in the pen is going to basically change the stroke or the outline of the object. So let's say, for instance, I wanted to choose, let's keep it solid. But if I click on the color drop down, I might then want to click on the color wheel, and maybe I'm just going to choose red. Click OK. So for anyone who missed that, I'm just clicking on the drop down next to color, clicked on the little colorful color wheel, and I'm just choosing a color from there. So I'm just going to do this as an example for a minute. And let's say, for instance, I wanted this to have a blue outline as an example. You know, I could change the color of my pen, set that to blue. You see here I've got my list of line weights in the pen thickness. So this is super easy to configure line weights. Let's set that to the thickest for now. I'm just going to click OK. Now you see that nothing's changed, right? And you're probably thinking, well, what was the point of that? You know, what has this achieved? What this has achieved is that we've now got that set up. So for instance, if I wanted to change an object to use that class, I can. So I could click on this circle here. Up here in my object info, I can come to the class dropdown, and I can now choose a different class. And you might get a little warning that says, do you want the selected objects to use the graphic attributes of the new class? Yes, we do. And firstly, that looks horrible. It looks disgusting. And I apologize for having vibrating colors on the screen. I will change that immediately. But it's just useful to know that you can always assign that class to different objects. You can always tick this box as well. So always do the selection action. So if I now wanted to change this class, I could right click back on the thick line weight class. In fact, I want to right click and go to edit. And let's say, for instance, that red is hurting my eyes. Maybe I want to put that back to white. I can click OK. And because those objects still have that class applied, they're going to update with it. So again, it's quite a complex system, but it's really, really super useful. And it means that if you're using classes as you're drawing, when it comes to the end of having like a finished drawing, when you want to print it out, if you realize that actually my line weights for my walls aren't quite right, or maybe I want to rescale some hatches or patterns, you can do that super fast simply by adjusting your classes. So it's a really useful one to know. So I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes now. I want you to explore making a couple of classes. So for instance, I'm just going to come back and edit this one. I'm going to set this back to black. I did say that this one's the thick line weight. As you can see, we've now got a thick line weight. I can make a new one. I can call this one medium line weight. Edit properties after creation. As always, I'm going to make sure in my textures tab, I untick this first box, the user creation, and then tick user creation in the graphics attributes. And again, if it's just line weights I'm setting up, the only thing I need to change here is the pen thickness. If I'm using that doubling factor, I know that my thick line weight was 2, so my medium is probably going to be 1. And that's now set up. So it's just a case of selecting my object, changing the class that's applied to it. So, oh yeah, question in the chat. Can I say that part again? What did I untick? Yep, no problem. So when you're back on your edit button, all you need to do is go to textures and untick the first one. You only need to untick this if you're not using textures in your class, just because sometimes they can conflict. So for instance, if you're only setting up line weights and hatches and things, then you probably want to untick this one. It's just that first box. And on the first tab, the graphics attributes, you do want to tick it, user creation. So I'm going to try something different this time. You know, at the moment, I've still got my none class selected. I've still got a little tick next to it. And if I were to try and make a shape again at the moment, you know, it's going to apply my none class, which is kind of rubbish. If I double click on my thick line weight, my thick line weight class, you see it's now got a little tick next to it. So that means it's now the active class. If I draw the same rectangle again this time, you see it's now drawn it with that class already applied. So it saves you having to draw an object, select it, and change the class after. If you've got your classes set up, just double click on the class to activate it, draw your shape, and that will already be applied. And it probably is worth mentioning at this point how to delete objects. Super easy to delete things. You just simply click on it, hit delete, or you can click and drag to make selections. And you'll notice that you have to completely cover an object to have it selected. So for instance, I have fully selected this rectangle. I haven't fully selected this circle. It's only going to select the rectangle. You have to fully drag over the objects. I believe dragging from left to right will also do different selections. I can't remember what the differences are there, but that might just be AutoCAD, I'm not sure. So again, a couple more minutes to play with that. Or actually, 1 more minute to play with line weights. It's good to get into the practice of it. Another thing worth mentioning as well, of course, is if it's purely line work that you're doing, you probably don't want a fill to these classes at all. So for instance, you might not want these shapes filled in which case, where it says fill, you could just change these to none, and it would remove the fill from them. I could turn none off on all of these. Not sure what class they're using. That's using the medium line weight class. Yeah. So let's turn those off. So again, just a couple of minutes to play around with these. I do want you to play with some of these drop downs as well. So for instance, in the fill, maybe you do want to fill it with something. In fact, let's just start a fresh hatch, a fresh class. I'm just going to call this pattern 1. Maybe this time, maybe instead of having a solid fill like we had before, maybe I'm going to choose a pattern. So for instance, I could choose a pattern, and I could choose to fill it with any of these, or I could choose hatch. I could choose to fill it with any of my hatches from my resource manager. I could choose to tile. And again, I can have a mixture of different tile types. So again, this stuff can be really useful the more you play with it. It saves you having to set this stuff up yourself. So for now, let's just say I've called this this new class pattern 1. On my fill drop down, I'm going to choose pattern. And I'm just going to choose one of these patterns, maybe this kind of diagonal lines. I'm just going to click OK. And as before, I'm just going to click on my object, change the class to my pattern. So that's kind of cool. That's not bad. Now, as before, I can still continue to modify this. So I can right click on where it says pattern 1 and go to edit. And again, I can change the foreground and the background color here. So this is quite nice and useful. So maybe I wanted a foreground color of red, for instance. And now it's changed those to red. So it is quite intuitive once you get the hang of it. Once you've practiced these a little bit, and again, this is being recorded. You can always come back and play around with these. But once you get the hang of them, they are so useful. And this is the hardest thing about Vectorworks. If you can play with these, you can do just about anything because all of the panels within Vectorworks kind of work this way. So again, probably 1 more minute just to play around with some of these. Okay, maybe not a full minute. I think that's more than enough time to play with some of those classes. Does anyone have any questions on classes so far? Again, you're welcome to either unmute or type in the chat or put a hand up, whatever you prefer. No, cool. Right. One thing to mention is, you remember I said earlier to drag out that attributes palette that was down in the bottom left? We dragged it out and placed it roughly up here in the top left. This actually does a very similar thing to classes. So it's like essentially like a quick navigation, as it were. So let's say, for instance, I've clicked on my circle that has these red diagonal lines, or you could click on this one that just has a thick line weight, for instance. You can quickly change attributes here on the left. So currently the fill color is set to class style. The pen is set to class style because we have a class applied to it. If I wanted to override these, if I just didn't want to mess around with setting up a new class, if I just want to quickly edit it for a single object, I can just do that here. So for instance, I could set my my fill color to just be solid. I could click on the colored panel there. I could just quickly tell this to be blue, for instance, and it would fill that in blue. And same with the pen. You know, I could change my pen to be line type. In fact, let me just remove that fill for a minute. I could set that to be line type. I could click in the little panel underneath, and I can choose my default line types. And this is where we can kind of access the Vectorworks libraries. So the one that's going to be useful is, we'll see here, we've got some folders under where it says Vectorworks Libraries. It says defaults, attributes line types, default line types. So I'd recommend to click on that, and now you can access all of the different line types that you can use in Vectorworks. So maybe I want to choose this complex looking one, this waterproof material. Click OK. If I use the scroll wheel to zoom in, you see it's created this line type, this quite complex line type, and applied that to my object. And of course, you can set up a class to do the same thing. I just wanted to quickly mention what the line types are and how to get to them. So if I just want a simple dashed one, so let's use an ISO 03 dash space. Again, I can change that to become dashed lines. Lastly, you can also change things like endpoint styles. So this is probably going to be better to be explained with just a single line. If I select this line, I could choose an endpoint style. So maybe I want to have a little arrow on the end, something like that. These are all kind of predetermined. So the size is, say, for instance, 0.05. It's already got like an angle, a line thickness, stuff like that set. You can choose custom, and you can change the size of these. So for instance, where we've got the length of the arrow, currently it's 3.175, I could make this bigger. Or I could choose a different thing. Maybe I don't want an arrow, maybe I want like an oval on it. Maybe I want to change the thickness of it. So maybe I want to set this up to like 5. I can click OK. And you see it's now changed the shape and the size. So again, all of these little things that you want to just kind of tweak and adjust, all of those can be done through attributes. Right, I think that's kind of it for those, at least for classes. There is something that I do want to quickly mention, and that's these drop-down tools at the top. So what I want you to do, I just want you to make a couple of overlapping shapes. And in fact, I want you to do this with your none class selected. So double click on your class that says none, and just make 2 overlapping shapes, something like that. So for anyone who missed it, double click none, just make two shapes that overlap. Again, they don't have to be circles, they can be anything. Good question. So I know how I'm drawing outside of the grid on the page. Is that a problem? No, not a problem at all. So that is something that is worth mentioning. So this grid over here, this essentially represents our design layer, as it were. So on our design layer over here, it represents this. And what this will do is it will give us a default page size to work on. And on our design layer, we can set a scale where we might be drawing to. So by default, this is going to be set to 1 to 50 at, I think, A3 or A4. I can't remember. It's one of those two. And it just means that if you wanted to draw directly onto a page, you could do that. So as I type in measurements, I could type in the real world scale, but it's going to show it drawn nice and small to fit on a page. I'm not worrying about any of that for now. I'm just drawing shapes, so don't worry about that. But even if you're doing a final drawing, if it goes out of this page, doesn't matter at all. And in fact, some people just prefer to turn this off altogether. Again, it just comes down to preference. But you will always be able to make a drawing just about anywhere. And then when we set up the viewport, we can just basically draw around the viewport, draw around the object, and tell that to go onto a sheet layer. So you'll always be able to get a drawing onto a sheet. Right, coming back to this one. So I've got my two objects that overlap. You see that at the moment, this bottom circle is sitting on top of this top circle, yeah? What I can do is I can come to my modify dropdown and I can play with some of these settings just here, like add surface, clip surface, intersect surface, combine intersurface. So what I'd want to do, I want to have my two objects selected first. So I'm just going to click and drag, or you can hold Shift and click on multiple objects. That's a good way to click on multiple things. Make sure you've got both objects selected. I'm going to go to my modify dropdown, and I can choose a mixture of these settings just here. So I'm going to choose clip surface to begin with. So I selected my two objects, I went to modify, I chose clip surface, and it still looks exactly the same. But if I now move this bottom circle, you see it's now clipped my top circle. So it's actually kind of used this shape to cut into this top one. It's clipped the object. So that's a really useful one to know. I'm just going to press Ctrl-Z to go back a couple of times. I've gone back to where I can see both circles again. Now, if I wanted it to go the other way around, for instance, if I wanted this top circle to be on top, I would simply select my object, go to modify, go to send, and you can choose send to front, send to back, any of these that you want to do. So for those of you that have worked with Illustrator before or InDesign, any of those kind of softwares, you'll be familiar with draw orders, most likely. But essentially, if I bring this to the front, it means it's going to bring it as close to us as we can. And now that object is sitting on top. And if I were to have chosen it to go to the back, if I choose send to back, that would send it to the back of the drawing. So that's something that's really important to know, I think. So modify send, bring to front. And again, if I were to select them again and choose clip surface again, you see it's now clipped it the other way around. It's now clipped my bottom shape. It's always going to use the shape on top as the cutting object. The thing underneath is the thing that's going to be cut. So it's a good rule of thumb. So I've just pressed Ctrl-Z again to undo. I've got back to my two shapes, so they're not clipped anymore. I'm going to select them again. This time I'm going to go to modify, and I'm going to choose add surface. And you see what that one's done. It's merged these two shapes together. So now I've got this kind of snowman looking thing. So it's no longer any overlapping shapes. Now got my two shapes merged into one single object. And I'm just going to press Ctrl-Z to undo. So I want you to play around with some of those settings. For instance, Intersect Surface is a useful one. Intersect Surface will basically find the area where they overlap. And it won't actually affect the original two. They're both still perfect circles, but it's now extracted the area where they overlap. So that can be really, really useful as well. Oh, didn't select that one. And the last one is Combine into Surface. So Combine into Surface means that you can basically click on kind of like any kind of boundary. And I'll show you a better example of this one in a second. You can essentially click on any kind of boundary and it will find all of the outer edges of it. So for instance, I clicked within there and it found the outer edges of that shape and it's now made that its own shape. It hasn't affected the original objects. It's just made a new shape based on all of those boundaries. So let's say, for instance, I had something messy. So I'm just going to do a bunch of overlapping lines. Something like that. So clearly not a very good drawing, yeah? If I wanted to extract this as a perfect shape without needing to go around and trim and clean it up and set fill colors, I can still do that super easily with that tool. So for instance, I can select my line work. I can go to modify. I can choose combine into surface. If I just click inside, you see it finds that boundary. And now I can move that boundary out. And it's found a really nice clean path for it. It's going to ignore all of the overlapping open areas and it will just find a closed boundary. So that's something that's worth knowing. The final thing from here, before we move on to 3D stuff, because I promise you we're going to do some 3D today, and the 3D stuff gets really cool really quick. The final thing here would be to select the object, and this works particularly well if you're working with a closed shape, like this polygon that we just made. And if you go to modify, you can choose to decompose. And decompose is essentially the same as explode in other software. So if you're used to AutoCAD or Rhino, any of those, this is essentially how you explode things. You decompose them. And that's now got it back to having it as single lines. So I could now modify these and move them around, for instance. So if I click on the endpoint, in fact, I don't actually want to modify that. Let's not modify that one. Instead, what I'm going to do, I'm going to select them because you see they're all individual objects. If I select them, I can go back to modify and I can just choose compose. And that will join them back together into one closed polygon. So that's essentially how you work with most of the 2D tools. Now, one thing we haven't done is added any dimensions to anything. We haven't used that ribbon that I was telling you about in the beginning. So I'm just going to delete these. So for instance, if I use my rectangle tool, for instance, notice as well when I hover over these, it does tell you keyboard shortcuts. So the shortcut for rectangle is the number 4. It's worth knowing. If I click on my rectangle tool, I can click on how I want to basically make this rectangle. So for instance, I've got corner to corner mode. That means that when I click, it's going to ask me to define the opposite corner. So it's going to go corner to corner. That's one way to do it. Or I could do the next one that says center to corner. So for instance, I could click and now it's going to be scaling out from the center of the rectangle rather than corner to corner. So that's essentially what these do at the top. It's just changing the way that we're drawing the shape that it is that we want to draw. And to type in dimensions of these things is super, super easy. So I've put this back to corner mode. I've clicked my first point. As I'm hovering, you might notice these boxes coming up. And essentially all you want to do is just start typing. So if I want my x-axis, just notice when we hover, it's got the little triangle with an x, little triangle with a y. So this is defining it on the x and y axis. And as we all know, x-axis is always the horizontal on our screen, y-axis is usually the vertical on our screen. And the z-axis would be our 3D axis, our height when we start extruding. So we're not worrying about z just yet. But if I wanted this to be 5 meters wide, I could type in, wrong button. What it was, hang on. There we go. Yeah. If I wanted to add dimensions, I could just hit the tab key on my keyboard. Tab key is usually on the left of your keyboard, and you might have a little arrow on it. If you hit the tab key, you'll see you can cycle between the different dimensions. So I could type in 5,000, hit tab. Now I can define my y-axis. Maybe I want this to only be 1,000 millimeters. And once I've typed in my x and y dimensions, I hit enter. I've now got an object that is those dimensions. And that's essentially how you dimension things. But remember, if you do accidentally mess it up for any reason, or if you just decide you want to change it later, it's just a case of selecting your object. And remember, you can just change it again up here. So if I wanted to make this have a height of 3 meters, I'll just type in 3,000 for height, hit enter. It's going to resize it. So I'm going to give you just 60 more seconds to play around with that. Play around with the ribbon a little bit, get a feel for how these work. Playing with the circle tool in particular is quite an interesting one. By default, it does it on radius mode, where it goes from the center to defining a radius. But you can do it between objects. So for instance, I could do a diameter. Maybe I want to do it from that corner to that corner. Maybe I want to define it between objects. So maybe between 3 objects. So I could click maybe that point, and maybe that point. I could tell things to fit between those. So again, it's a useful one to know. But definitely one that takes quite a bit of practice though. Well, I don't know where this session's gone. We've only got 40 minutes left. It's only a 2-hour session today. I'm in back-to-back meetings today, so I need to shoot straight off after this one. I have to do a follow-up session to this. Right, I am going to go straight on to the next bit. The final thing we haven't touched on so far is using the snaps. Now, if you've ever used the previous version of Vectorworks, you would probably know that you usually have a panel that looks like this, specifically for your snaps, yeah? In Vectorworks 2022, the newest version, they've got rid of that snap panel, which annoyed me so much at first because I didn't realize they've moved the snaps down here into the bottom right. And this is actually really intuitive. So for instance, we got snap to grid is the very first one down here in the bottom right. And if I were to draw like a line, for instance, I should be able to snap to the grid. In fact, I need to zoom in a bit more. There we go. Yeah, so I can snap to any point based on this kind of grid. So there's like a little subgrid in there. I can snap to those. In fact, yeah, when you zoom out a little bit, you might just be able to see the little dots. It's a bit hard to see on this screen because of the way I've got my settings adjusted. I'm not a fan of snapping to grid, so I always have that on off anyway. You might have also had this window pop up, by the way, that says Vectorworks, 15 minutes have elapsed since the first operation was performed. Do you want to make a backup? I would recommend yes. I'm not going to bother today because I'm not actually making anything, but tell it to save every 15 minutes. I think that's a good amount of time by default to back up your work. At least that way, if it does crash, you've never lost any more than 15 minutes worth of work. So I think it's worth setting that up. So next thing. Again, you've got different types of snaps down here. If I didn't have any of these enabled, I'm not going to be able to snap to anything. So for instance, if I'm trying to draw from this corner there, I can try and click on it as best as I can. Click to join to that. And as you'll see when you zoom in, I did a rubbish job of snapping to those objects, yeah? And essentially, all I want to do is just turn on my point snaps. So if you hover over these, it does give you the proper names, snap to object. I could click on that corner now. You see when I hover over the object, it now comes up. Now it allows me to snap to midpoints, I can snap to endpoints, I can snap to quadrants of circles. It just means that I'm going to be drawing much more accurately. So I would say play around with some of these snaps just in your own time. The useful ones that I quite like are snap to object, so you can snap to the corners and middle points and stuff of objects. Snapping to angles can be useful. So for instance, if I bring it out to the right, that's an angle of 0. If I bring it up, it's going to snap to 30, then 45, then 60, and then 90. So it will snap to the most common angles. If you don't want it to do that, just turn off that angle snap and it will turn off. And the other one that can be quite useful is smart points. So let's say, for instance, I've got my smart points on. What this allows me to do is if I'm drawing a line out over here, if I want to basically draw this line out to be in line with this one, I can hover over that point, drag my cursor up, and it gives me this guide, which is really nice. Now it gives me something to snap to. So that's what that smart guides does, or smart points. So the ones I have are snap to object, snap to angle, smart points. You might want to turn the smart points off once your file gets really, really heavy. So imagine, this is trying to pick up references based on the objects we have. If you've then got thousands of objects in a drawing, having smart points is probably not a good idea. It's going to be a nightmare to work with. It's going to be trying to create smart points based on everything. Oh, just seen there's a question in the chat. Does that just overwrite the last file that it's saved? So if you're doing the auto saves, the backups, you can configure how many of these you save, how many backups. I'm trying to remember which one it's under. It might be under tools. Yes, I think it's tools, options, Vectorworks preferences. So you've got auto save within there. You can choose how you have this backed up. So you could change your auto save to be every 15 minutes, or you could change that number. You can tell it to confirm before the save, just in case you don't want to accidentally overwrite something. You can choose a location, and I strongly recommend you make a note of this location, because if your file crashes and if you need to load a previous backup, yeah, it's good to know where they're located. And you can also choose the number of backups to save. So by default, if it's only set to 1, which it is by default, it means it's going to override your backup file, not your main file that you're working on, but your backup file, because it will create a separate backup. But I would usually have this set to 3. I would usually have 3 backups, because if my main file corrupts and my most recent backup corrupts, I should still be able to go to the previous 2 versions. And it will just kind of go in a cycle. So the first backup would go to slot 1, second backup would go to slot 2, third backup would go to slot 3, the fourth backup would then override slot 1 again, if that makes sense. So that's useful, I think. Right, I did promise you we're going to do some 3D, and this is where it starts getting really useful really quick. So to get to 3D, we need to now start playing with our design layers, because we know that our classes are setting up the visual style, which is pretty much the main thing with Vectorworks, to be honest. But if we're playing around with some 3D or even some 2D, you're going to want to work with multiple design layers. Now, I'm not going to configure this design layer at the moment. I'm only going to work on design layer number 1. I'm going to make sure that the class I have selected is none, by the way. So let's set this back to default. Now, rather than drawing something in 2D, I'm going to go straight to using the 3D building shell tools. So again, if we're on the architect's workspace, down here in the bottom left, you can choose building shell, and you will see that we have a mixture of different tools just here. So the one I'm going to use is the wall tool. Should be the very first one. And the shortcut for that is the number 9. So what this lets me do, I can start drawing, and you see I've just zoomed in so I can see the inside and outside of the wall. If you're zoomed out really far, it's just going to look like a straight line. If you're zoomed in really close, it might just look like a straight line. So again, zoom in or out until you can see both. And again, you can get an idea of dimensions. So currently it's looking to be about 3 meters, 4 meters, something like that. And as before, it's the exact same way to do dimensions as it is with 2D shapes. So if I hit tab, I could type in 10,000 to set this to 10 meters. If I hit tab again, I can set an angle. So maybe I want this first wall to be 10 meters at 45 degrees. So I can hit enter. I can click to place, and now I can place my next wall. So maybe I want this one to be 5 meters. Enter. Now it's going to ask me to choose the angle. So I can just click to place, and I can define that. Or if you don't want to worry about dimensions at all, you could just click around and you could just kind of freehand something if you really wanted to. Just going to bring that down like that. I'm going to give you a chance to do this in a sec on your own. But essentially, when you want to close your building, I recommend you always close your walls. You'll always be able to find the origin because it's going to have a little red rectangle on it, or at least it should do. If you hover over it, you'll be able to join it back up. Something like that. There we go. So I just want you to take a minute, play around with that wall tool. We're going to play around with configuring this in a sec. Then we're going to go with that. We're going to play around with modifying this in a second. So I want everyone just to use that wall tool, make one closed boundary. Doesn't have to be the most beautiful thing you've ever made. This certainly isn't anything particularly architectural right now. But yeah, we're going to play around at giving this some 3D height in a second. So literally about 30 seconds or so. Right, that should be enough time. So again, all you're doing, you're just using that wall tool. Don't worry too much about dimensions, as long as you can see essentially the offset of the wall. It doesn't even matter if you don't have any straight lines, but you do want to make sure you've closed that shape up. And once it's closed up, it should just fill that in white with black outlines. If you've got different patterns in there, if you've got really thick line weights or weird colors, it's probably because you might still have a different class selected. In which case, just go back, change your class, redraw your shape on your design layer. You should be good to go. Right, hopefully everyone has drawn a beautiful building. Now the cool thing with this is we've just drawn this in 2D, but it's actually already made a 3D representation of this shape. So we can actually change our view just at the top up here. So this one that says top/plan, I want you to click on that. So it's going to leave that up for a second. And I'd recommend that for now, we just put this into one of the 3D views. And I'm going to choose right isometric. When the box pops up, just click OK, and it should go something like this. Now for me, by default, mine is shaded in. Yours might not be shaded. Yours might look a bit different. In which case, up here, in the same place where we chose right isometric, sorry, losing my voice, where we chose right isometric, if you go a little bit further along to the right, you should find a little teapot. And essentially, this is just showing us the render mode. So how do we want to visualize what's on the screen? And render in any software is always a teapot, well, it's usually a teapot. I could change between wireframe. So now I can just see the wireframe of the object. I could change to shaded to shade these walls in. I could change to fast render works. And if I had materials and stuff applied, it then calculate things like the materials, the lighting, things like that I've applied. And they give me a bit of a nicer preview. It's still not that nice, to be honest. I could choose hidden line if I wanted to do something a bit more diagrammatic. So that's really nice if you're doing like exploded diagrams, for instance. So again, there's a lot of benefits to be gained by putting this into isometric and just changing the style. But for now, I'm going to put this back to shaded. Shaded means it's not going to calculate all the materials and lighting properly, but it will give us a good 3D representation of our model. So it's going to be the fastest way to work in 3D, the least intensive on our computer. So I've got my 3D, I know that we typed in some measurements to define the lengths and angles of the walls, but it didn't ask us anywhere to define the height. And this is where it gets a little bit more complex. So there's a few ways that we can basically define these. We can define our heights of the walls either by telling it to go up to the next layer, or we could simply just type in a height. You remember before our object info, if I select all of these walls, I could simply just type in a height of these walls and that would work. But there's a really clever way that we can do this. Now, what I can do, if I select all of my walls, you see I'm in my object info palette, I can set this to basically extrude by boundaries. So I've got my bot bound. This means my bottom boundary. This is set to the layer elevation. So essentially my design layer is set to start at 0 on the Z-axis. So I can tell my wall to take that layer's information so that the wall also starts at 0 on the Z-axis. I'm going to delete the offset because I'm not going to use an offset for this. Just hit 0. And you see that when you type in 0 into that top offset and hit enter, suddenly our walls go really flat. So don't need to worry about that for now. That's supposed to happen. Because what we're going to do, we're going to change this top boundary. We're going to change this to layer wall height. So you might want to take a quick screenshot of this screen just to see how I have this configured. So bottom boundary is set to layer elevation. Top offset is set to 0. The top boundary is set to layer wall height. Strongly recommend you make a note of those. Now I'm sure you're thinking, why is he going through the effort of doing this when he could just type in a height? Now the reason I'm going to do this is because if I decide I want to change the height of these walls again in the future, all I need to do is right click and edit this design layer. And I can edit all of the walls that are on that layer to bring them up to the same height. So imagine I'm working with a much more complex drawing than this. Let's say this is a full-blown building. Let's say we're doing the Jeffrey Manton building. We've got loads of external walls. We've got a mixture of internal ones, might have some partitions, might have some glazing and things. If all of that is defined by the layer, rather than me just typing in numbers, it means that if I decided I want an extra 500 millimeters of height, I could just edit the layer and everything will update. So to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to right click on my design layer. I'm going to go to edit. So you'll see that actually I'm not on the classes tab. I'm on the design layer tab. I'm going to right click on design layer 1 and go to edit. And there's a few things that I can change here. So I can change the height of my layer on the Z-axis. I want this to start at 0 because it's my ground floor layer. And I'm going to type in a layer wall height. So if I type in 3000 millimeters, that will bring it up to 3 meters high. I'm going to click OK. And you see that my walls have now popped up to 3 meters high. And again, this has the benefit of then me going to edit. If I now wanted to actually make them 5 meters high, I could just change that, click OK, and everything is going to update with it. It's all parametric. I'm actually going to put that back to 3000 because I think it looked better. So again, super, super fast way to work. Obviously, it took us a bit longer just then because we're exploring it for the first time. But, you know, once you're doing this yourself, super, super easy. And it also means that anything else that you draw on this can then inherit the same properties. If I'm drawing new walls, I'm just going to do this straight in 3D for now. They're going to inherit the exact same properties. In fact, they're not going to inherit the properties. I forgot to tick that button. There's a button. No, there's not a button. Okay. In that case, it just doesn't inherit the properties. But it does mean that whenever I make new walls, I can just quickly select them, change that to layer wall height, delete the offset, or type in 0 for the offset. Now that's going to also be constrained by this as well. So again, it's much faster, as you can see. There we go. Let's delete that one. Now, really cool thing with this, if we put this back into our top view, so click on where it says right isometric at the top. I'm going to put this back into top/plan. I'm going to start adding in some windows and doors. So I'm going to come over here onto my building shell, and I'm going to find the little image of a door. It says door tool. So there's a few ways we can use this, but for now, I'm just going to click to place the door on one of my walls. And you'll see that as I hover over each wall, it's going to highlight that wall red to say, do you want to intersect this door with the wall? So for instance, if I click on this wall down here, firstly, I can move my cursor left and right. So I can choose which way the door opens. I can also move it on either side of the wall to decide which way the door opens. So if I want it to open inwards, if I want it to open to the left, I'll bring my cursor over there, click to place, and that's now cut out my wall. So it's removed that, it's placed in a frame, it's added a door, and it's added the span of the door as well. I can add in as many of these as I like. And you see, it saves us having to manually draw this stuff. If I were to do this in AutoCAD without using the parametric tools, you know, I'd have to draw a rectangle, I would offset it to get a wall thickness, I would then have to trim part of it away, I'd make a rectangle to represent the door, make some rectangles for the frames, probably do a circle and trim it down. You know, it's a much more intensive job doing it in AutoCAD. I still love AutoCAD, don't get me wrong. AutoCAD for the win, but this is a nice way to do it. And the great thing with this, the thing that I absolutely love with Vectorworks, is that if I decide that actually, maybe I don't want this this wall placed there, this door placed there, I can simply click and drag it anywhere along that wall. And it's going to fill in where it was before, and it's now going to cut out that part of the wall elsewhere. And the even better thing is when we put this back onto our right isometric view, you see that it's now actually placed 3D doors into our building. So it's already cut them out, it's already placed frames in there, and yeah, it's got the door panels and everything. So it's one of those softwares where, you know, if you take a little bit of extra time to set it up, you know, playing with your classes and your design layers, you then get much faster when it comes to the modeling, because you don't need to manually model a lot of elements. So the key thing is the setup with Vectorworks. I'm going to come back to my top/plan view. I'm going to do the same thing with some windows. You see we've got a little window tool over here. So I'm going to place in some windows, choose which way they open. Perfect. And again, on my right isometric view, I can view those as well. Now, I'm sure you're thinking by now, like, well, this kind of looks okay, but what if I don't like this door? What if I don't like this wall material? What if I don't like these windows? What if I want a different style for each of these things? Well, we can do that. We can definitely do that. So I'm going to come back to my top plan, and I'm just going to make a new wall. I'm going to make a new building. I'm going to do a really simplified one. So I'm just going to do this next to my existing building I've made. I'm going to use my wall tool, but this time, instead of drawing out straight away like we did before, I'm going to come up to my ribbon. So firstly, you can see the way that we control the wall. So it's doing left control line mode at the minute, which means that the cursor is on the left side of the wall. If I set it to center, the cursor is now in the center of the wall. If I set it to right, it's now on the right side of the wall. We can also choose a few other settings. So I can either click on this wall tool preferences, or I could click on this unstyled button, this drop down, and I can choose a specific type of wall to work with. So there's a few things here you need to know. In fact, let me just go back to that because I'm guessing a few people might have missed it. So all I did to set up a new type of wall is I've clicked on the wall tool, and I'm just going to click on this drop down here that says unstyled next to wall style. Now, the types of walls that you can use depend on the way you're managing your layers. So I said to you, there's a few ways you can do it. Firstly, if you're working in metric, make sure you're using the metric templates. By default, this is chosen imperial, even though I chose to work in millimeters. I hate that Vectorworks does this. So make sure you're using one of the metric templates. And then some of them say story bounded, some of them say fixed height. Stories means that we can set up different stories as our layers. So for instance, we could set one up that says first story, second story, third story. It's an American naming system for that, which I don't really like. It's a very powerful way to work, but it's a much more complex way to work when you're first getting started. I'm actually not going to show you story bounding today. It's something that I'll do in a different session if you're interested. But instead, we know that we can set fixed heights based on our layers, which is a much faster way to edit. So essentially what I'm saying is that when I'm choosing from this drop down, I want to make sure I'm choosing a metric template, preferably fixed heights. In here, I can now choose my different wall types. And again, we can flick between a few of these sub drop downs. We've got metric landscape walls. We can choose those. We've got the UK fixed height walls. These are all metric as well. You can use all of these. And I'm sure most of these are going to be confusing as hell at first. No one really knows exactly what all of these things are. But if you hover over them, it does give you a bit of an explanation. So for instance, if I hover over this one says the wall type, it's EXT, which means it's an exterior wall, clay brick, cavity, insulation, and then the finishing is gypsum plaster. So I know that because I'm used to this naming system, but you can kind of get an idea of what it is that they represent. So I'm just going to click on one of these. I'm going to click on select. And what that now does is it means that when I start drawing my wall, I'm going to firstly see more lines because there's more layers of stuff within the wall. I can now start drawing this out. Come on, give me my guide. There we go. I can now start drawing this out and connect it up. And the cool thing with this is it's done all of our detailing for us. So take the time to specify your wall type and you'll be able to automatically get all of the construction details. These aren't 100% accurate. It's something that you'd want to look at things like Detail Magazine. You want to cross-reference things. You might want to modify the walls, for instance. Maybe you don't want this gypsum plasterboard inside. Maybe you don't want the batting to be this wide. There are things that you can still modify with these. I'll show you how you can do that as well, actually. But the cool thing with this is when we start placing in our doors and things, it is still going to chop all of these things out and it should cap them correctly. It actually hasn't capped it correctly, but it's fine. It's close enough. It's fine for what we need for now. So I've just placed in that standard door, really basic door for now. But what if I didn't want that horrible, ugly basic door? Well, it's the exact same thing as when we chose the walls. I can click on the door tool. I could choose the door style. And I've now got an army of different door styles over here that I can choose from. Let me just make this a bit bigger. So currently it's on barn doors for some reason. I don't want to choose hinged doors imperial. I want to choose hinged doors metric. And maybe I want to choose something a bit more interesting than what I had a minute ago. Let's say something like this. I'll select it. I'm just going to choose replace if it comes up with an error. Click on my wall, choose where to place it. And now that's placed that door in there. So it's added the extra little window bits of glass next to it. And obviously, if I go to right isometric, I can now see I've got a much more complex door in there, which is kind of cool. Now, I could easily spend all day going through these, but I'm just going to very quickly show you how you can set up another story, how you can set up your next floor. So firstly, we don't have an actual floor plane in this, which is a bit of a problem. So I'm going to go back to my top plan. And what I want to do, I just want to make essentially like a boundary to fill my floor in with. And we can do this quite easily with, I believe it's the 2D Polygon Tool. So if I go to my 2D Polygon Tool, it's the one that looks quite jagged up here in the top left. Instead of clicking to manually draw, which is what it's going to do at the minute, I'm actually going to choose to change this to outer boundary mode. And what this means is I can click and drag around my object to make a selection. When I let go, it will find the outer boundary and it will make a perfect polygon based on that boundary. Makes my life so much easier, right? So I can come back to my isometric. It's now filled that in with a surface. That surface doesn't have any thickness. We haven't defined it as a floor object just yet. I'll show you how to do that. But essentially we now have something in there that can act as a floor. And if I do want to turn this into a floor, it's just a case of selecting that shape we just made. And then I can go to AEC. Can anyone tell me what AEC stands for in the chat? Anyone? So for those of you that don't know, AEC stands for Architecture, Engineering and Construction. So this is where we get most of our architectural tools. So the cool thing with this is, let's say I've drawn out a shape like this outer boundary that we just filled in. If I wanted to turn that into a floor, I can go to AEC, my architecture tools, and go to floor. And I could turn that into a floor. Or if I were to turn it into a roof, if I'd drawn it at the top, I could create a roof from it. If I had a bunch of shapes that I've arrayed, I could turn them into pillars. So again, these are actually really useful tools that you can play with. I'm just going to go to floor. So to convert this into a floor, it needs to know a thickness. So I'm actually going to type in the thickness first. Maybe I want a floor thickness of 200. Then it's asking for a bottom Z. So it's saying the bottom part of this extrusion, this part here, where should that be on the Z axis? Now for the ground floor, this is a bit of a tricky question because we know that the ground floor walls start at 0. So we probably want the top of the floor slab to be 0. So my bottom slab, I'm actually going to set to be -200. So that means that the bottom of my slab is going to be -200. The thickness it extrudes to is 200, and that will bring it back up to the bottom of my walls. When I click OK, you see it's now added my floor slab in there. Yep, so Sadia just asked, could I repeat how to quickly create those floors? I'll do a very quick overview if I just undo that enough. So I've gone back to my top/plan view, and I believe it only works in this view. I don't think you can do it in the other views. So I'm in my top/plan. I'm going to use my 2D polygon tool, not to be confused with polyline. So 2D polygon. I'm going to use this little lasso tool, this outer boundary mode. I'm going to just click around. So click and drag to make a selection. And when you let go, it makes that boundary. And then again, to convert this into a 3D floor, with that object selected, it's going to go to AEC, go to floor. I want my floor slab to start 200 millimeters below this wall, so minus 200. And then the thickness I'm going to set to be 200 thick, so it meets the bottom of the wall. Click OK. Got myself a nice pretty floor slab. Now, very quickly, because we've only got 5 minutes left, very quickly, I'm going to make a new layer. So this is going to be my second floor. You might want to call this ground floor, first floor, second floor, etc. I'm being lazy today. As always, we're going to tick edit properties after creation. And the cool thing with this is if you've already set up your previous layer's height, for instance, we set that to go up to 3 meters, it's going to set your next layer elevation to be 3 meters. So this next layer is going to automatically start on top of this wall. So it means you don't need to manually draw things elsewhere and move them around. It's just a much nicer way to work. So layer elevation is 3 meters. Maybe I also want this to have a layer wall height of 3 meters, which would be kind of cool. So I'm going to click OK. And when you click OK, it does this. And this is where people freak out. They're like, has my computer just broke? Has it glitched out? What's happened? Nope, it's absolutely fine. So what's happened is just above our layers, you see we've got these layer options and filters, yeah? So at the moment, our layer options say grey/snap to others. And as we've made this new layer, it's already set that as our new default. So our new design layer that is enabled is default design layer 2. So it means that anything I draw now is going to appear on design layer 2. All other layers are grayed out, but we can still see them. They're just grayed out, and we can still snap to them. So for instance, if I wanted to start drawing some stuff, I could still snap to all of this geometry if I wanted to, which is kind of cool. I wonder if it will also let me extract that as a boundary to make a new slab. So let's try making a new slab. Nope, didn't find the boundary. So that's a bit of a shame it didn't find the boundary, but it's not the end of the world. Let's put this back to 3D. If I don't want this, if I just want to always be able to modify everything, I could always just click on the layer drop down and choose the final one, show snap and modify others. That would allow me to see everything all in one go. But the problem with that one is if I'm working on my design layer 2, if I accidentally like drag a wall or something, then that's going to affect my other layers. So it can be a bit of a problem. So just be a bit clever, a bit strategic with how you're doing these. There we go, grayed out. One thing that's also good to know is if I come back to my design layer 1, if I select all of these objects like that slab and the walls, if I do Control-C to copy, click back on my design layer 2 and press Control-V, I can bring them into place, which is kind of cool. Or if you go to Edit, you can choose Paste in Place, and it will bring it into the exact same location, but on your next layer up, which is really cool. The only thing you'd need to be careful of with that, though, is if you've already added a floor slab, and if you've done it to minus numbers, then that's now going to cut down minus 200 into that wall. So again, just something to be aware of. That's an easy one to fix. I could just come back to my design layer 1 and go to edit. I could just take 200 off of this. So 2,800, click OK. And now it sits at the bottom of there. And of course, I probably don't want that floating up there. So it's a very, very fast way to start modeling. Unfortunately, this is the end of the session. I've got another meeting in a minute, so I do need to shoot straight off. We didn't quite get around to playing around with design, sheet layers and design layers, or viewports even, but I will very quickly kind of rush through these just so you can watch the video back and do it at your own pace. So essentially, to make a sheet layer, it's just a case of right-clicking and going to New. I could give this sheet a number. So for instance, number 1. I could give the sheet a title. Maybe I'll call this ground floor plan. Maybe I want it to be an A3 page, so I'll call it ground floor plan A3. Edit properties after creation. And now I just need to set up that page size. So page setup, I could choose either the printer setup or choose an available page size here. I've got ISO A3. I can click OK, then I'm good to go. And obviously you can change between like landscape and portrait and stuff in your printer setup and that. So again, something to play around with. I could set that to be landscape there. I could choose A3 to get my full list of things. There we go. That's a bit better. So I went to printer setup that time, set it to landscape, click OK. Maybe set the DPI a bit higher, set that to 300 dots per inch, just because it's going to be printed out. It doesn't let you preview it by default. We're still looking at the design layer for now, but we do have an empty blank page defined now. And what this means is when I'm ready, if I wanted to start putting my 2D and 3D drawings onto a piece of paper, I would just go to my viewports, make a new viewport, and now I can set up this viewport. So follow this in order. So for instance, it says first viewport, create on layer. So I want this to create my viewport on my ground floor plan A3 sheet, because that's where I want my drawing to go to. I can choose to add a label to it. So I could give it like a drawing name and stuff if you wanted to. Where it says layers, this is saying what layers do you want to be visible. Maybe I only want my ground floor, so I could turn the visibility to X for my design layer 2. I could keep the I on for design layer 1. That means I can only see design layer 1. I could change my classes. So I've now got quite a few classes appearing because I was using those custom walls. I could choose to override those if I wanted to, or I could keep them on. I can change a scale. So the good thing with this is the detail within those walls. When you export them, they will also change depending on the scale that you export to. I'm going to keep this at 1:50 for now. I can always change it after. I can change the level of detail. So if I want to keep it low, it's going to give me a nice simplified drawing. If I keep it high, it's going to give me all the detailed hatches. Let's set it to high actually. And I think that's going to be about it. Obviously it asks you what view do you want to capture. So we want to capture the top/plan view. What style do you want? Do you want it wireframe like a technical drawing? Do you want it shaded? Do you want it hidden line? So you still get to choose all of that. And then lastly, what type of projection? So I'm going to choose a 2D plan projection. So I'm going to click OK. And what that's done, it's now jumped straight to my viewport, and I can see that sitting on the sheet. So I've got the sheet that I defined on my sheet layer. That's this A3 page. I've now got the objects that I'm trying to fit within that sheet set up as a viewport. If that doesn't fit for any reason, I can right click and edit the viewport. I can change that scale. Maybe I now want it to be 1:100. Click OK, and it will scale them down to fit. Or if I wanted to change the visual style, I can edit that viewport. In fact, if I zoom into this, there's not actually any detail to that. Yeah, there's no detail to show off. It's the wrong building. If I were to change the view, if I don't want the top/plan view, if I want a right isometric, I can choose that. Currently it's on wireframe mode, so I'll probably want to change that to something like hidden line. So currently background render is render wireframe, change that to shaded. Yes, this is what I wanted it to do. So when you make enough changes, after a while, you won't see the changes taking place. And instead, you see these red diagonal lines appearing around the drawing. This is very common, and you can fix it really easily by right-clicking and choosing Update. And that will now update. So that's now laid out on a sheet. That's ready to go. You can also right-click and go to Edit Annotations if you want to be able to move these bits around. That's another thing that annoys people. Exit the view after. I think that's about it. I think that's going to be enough to get you started. You know, we've explored the custom walls, we explored the drawing tools, we added in some windows, we added in some floors, we covered the classes, design layers, sheet layers, and viewports just about. Yeah, I think that's going to be about it. Make sure you save your files often. The only extra things worth mentioning is I did say that at the beginning of the session about not downloading the extra libraries. If you want to download the extra libraries, you can just click on the help, go to download content. Hopefully you're able to see the window that just popped up. I've just had a window that popped up that said Vectorworks Package Manager. And now I can download all the extra materials, extra objects, extra wall types, different furnitures and things. It's pretty fantastic stuff. Obviously, the file sizes for these are huge. So if you have a relatively low capacity on your computer, you probably don't want to install all of them. So again, just something to kind of bear in mind. I think that's about it. The only other thing was that resource manager. If I just go to palettes and resource manager, we've kind of already covered this quite a bit today because we're using it every time that we're making new wall types, new door types, etc. But if you just wait to drag objects in, you can load up the resource manager, find an object. So for instance, an architectural object. Maybe in fact, maybe I don't want an architectural object. Maybe I want building furnishings. Maybe I want to bring in like a rug or something. I can navigate through the volume of rugs. Find one that I absolutely love. I really don't love that. Make sure I'm on my design layer first. Find the rug that I love. And it's just a case of dragging it in. And it will download that and it will place it in the scene. Currently, this one that I just chose is story bounded, which is annoying. And that's placed that in as a rectangle. When I go to render it, I would then be able to see that as an actual visual thing. Right, that is that. One final question in the chat was, what's the best way to get in contact with me, on Teams or email? I would say either one of those is fine. Teams or email is good. I'm completely backed up the rest of today in back-to-back meetings. But remember as well, there are the ADD drop-in clinics on Moodle. I recommend everyone signs up for. It's going to make me sign in now. Oh, it didn't make me sign in. That's a first. Yeah, you can just scroll down, come down to the drop-in clinics, and then you can just book a slot here for your drop-in clinics. You should be all sorted after that. So I'm going to be doing them tomorrow afternoon, Friday afternoon, and then Monday next week I'm doing them as well. Then we've got So On Mahmood doing the Tuesdays and Wednesdays. Don't forget you got Vectorworks University as well, the resource I showed at the beginning with all the extra courses. And there's links to that in the chat. Right, that's it. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. Hopefully you found that useful. There's quite a lot of stuff to go through in only 2 hours, but hopefully you get an idea of how this system works now. Bye. See you next time.